Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm just going to give it a few moments for everyone joining us live to get in the room, but thank you so much for joining us to discuss this important issue. Still waiting on a few more to join. Okay. And hello and welcome, everyone. I am Yara, 2023 Palestine Non-Resident Fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. And welcome to our webinar today entitled Dead, Disabled, Displaced, Detained, Orphaned, the Toll of Israel's War on Palestinian Children. Today is April 25th, 2024. So a little housekeeping before we begin. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion style between the panelists, who I'll introduce momentarily, and myself. It will end in about an hour, 1 p.m. Eastern. It's being recorded and live streamed on Facebook, so thanks to all of you joining us live on Facebook, and this will also be available as a podcast. We're eager to take audience questions, so please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can do so at any time throughout the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on these questions, and I will do my best to try to incorporate as many of them into our discussion as it unfolds. Please keep an eye on the chat box. My colleagues at FMEP will be putting useful links about things that we're talking about, reports, studies, and other kinds of information in that box throughout the discussion, so you can look into them afterwards. And finally, please note that we have enabled the closed captioning function, so you can read the discussion. To begin, Israel's unrelenting assault and siege of Gaza and the increasing violence against Palestinians in the West Bank by both Israeli soldiers and settlers, now being referred to as the Quiet War, have affected Palestinian children in particularly horrific ways. Human rights researchers have documented many specific harms in Gaza, including the murder of at least 13,800 children, undoubtedly thousands more still missing under the rubble. At least 19,000 children have lost parents. Many are orphaned completely, the last surviving members of their family. And more than 1,000 have become amputees as a result of this. More than 1 million children have lost their homes and are displaced. Dozens of children have already starved to death, and up to 60% of the children in northern Gaza are experiencing acute malnutrition in a famine that is spreading at the fastest rate of starvation on record anywhere in the world, and which may constitute the war crime of deliberate starvation. We've heard less about the plight of children with pre-existing conditions that required care they are now unable to attain. For example, 9 children who required urgent kidney dialysis treatment died in February while waiting to be evacuated. As the UNRWA Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, put it, this war is a war on children. It is a war on their childhood and their future. And in the West Bank and East Jerusalem at the same time, Palestinian children continue to face arrest and detention, which has been expedited since October 7th, home demolitions and expulsions. Over the past 6 months, increased violence at the hands of the IDF and IDF-backed settlers over the past 6 months have killed 117 children, including just a few days ago at a refugee camp near Tulkarm, where Israeli forces killed 14 Palestinians, including 3 children, and this was documented by DCI Palestine. In this webinar today, we're going to discuss these Israeli crimes against Palestinian children. It is worth noting that the situation of Palestinian children in each artificially fragmented area is in some ways different. Of course, the difference between the Gaza Strip today, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and also those inside the Green Line in Israel, but the overarching issues are the same: Israeli contempt for their lives and welfare. So I'm very grateful to be joined to talk about this multitude of issues today with 2 experts and human rights defenders who have extensive experience in protecting Palestinian children. Miranda Cleland is an advocacy officer at Defense for Children International, Palestine, and lives in Washington, D.C., where she leads the No Way to Treat a Child campaign and advocates for the human rights of Palestinian children. Miranda is a writer, speaker, facilitator, and campaigner with expertise in children's rights, the Israeli military detention system, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and Israeli military killings of Palestinian children. She holds a bachelor's with honors from American University in International Studies and Arabic language, and has taken additional coursework in international law and the protection of children in armed conflict. Thanks for joining us, Miranda. And our other guest is Hamdi Shaqqura, a human rights defender who lives and works in Gaza. He holds a master's degree in political science from Illinois State University from 1990, and he's been working at the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, PCHR, since 1995, and is Deputy PCHR Director for Program Affairs, as well as the Director of the Advocacy Program. So Miranda and Hamdi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So
Thank you,
we
Yara.
have so many things to discuss in such a short amount of time. So I want to get first to this, what should be a relatively, you would think, straightforward and easy question. But from your perspective, we're talking today about children, and there's been a lot of scholarship about this kind of unchilding phenomena of Palestinian children, about how they are treated with the same over-securitized, violent lens that all Palestinians are subject to. So tell me, from your perspective, who is a child? And then more logistically, can you tell us how many Palestinian children there are in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and inside Israel? And then lastly, can you tell me why, both today in this conversation and more broadly speaking, as you've done in your work, why is it important to look at children uniquely as a distinct population? And Miranda, I'll turn to you first.
Thanks so much, Yara, and thank you to the Foundation for Middle East Peace for holding this webinar. I'm very grateful to be here alongside my esteemed colleague, Hamdi. Under international law, a child is any person under the age of 18. So in many ways, this definition is not really up for debate or consideration. This is a definition that's been accepted and outlined in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which is one of the most widely ratified human rights treaties in the world, ratified by every country in the world except the United States. And the CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, is much of what we base our work on at DCI Palestine, in that it is essentially a special Bill of Rights for children that all parties, especially Israel as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory, alongside the Palestinian Authority, has the duty to uphold the rights of children as outlined in the CRC.
I just may add a little thing on this. First of all, thank you really for organizing this great webinar on children in Palestine. This is the law, as Miranda put it direct. Age 18 is the limit to define a child. However, this is not the case in Palestine when it comes to the occupation. Israeli occupation applies and very discriminatory measures in terms of the legislations in both the occupied territories, whether Gaza and the West Bank, they apply military orders. In Israeli territory, they apply Israeli legislations according to Israeli legislations applicable in Israel and in Israeli settlements as well, because this is the same definition. This is the limit. 18 years old is the limit for a child. However, in the OPT, it's 16. So they consider any person who is between the age of 16 and 18 as a mature. And this is not only very discriminatory, but the basic rationale behind this is to deprive this category of people, of children, the proper protection, the special protection ensured for children. And this is only in Gaza by military, of course, orders, and in the West Bank.
Thank you for that. And just so we know exactly the population we're talking about, frequently we've heard the death toll in Gaza is overwhelmingly children. We're hearing of disproportionate violence against children in the West Bank. So, Miranda, can you tell us about how much of the population of Palestine, the occupied territories, are children?
Yeah, about half of all people in the occupied Palestinian territory are children. So we're talking upwards of 2 million children.
Yeah. So whenever we talk about crimes against Palestinians, inherently they are crimes against children. Hamdi, I want to turn to you for this next question. So Israel, as the occupying power, is almost entirely responsible for the reality that Palestinian children face daily, in regards to accessing healthcare, in regards to their social welfare, the education that they can seek and what they can do with that education afterwards in terms of employment, across the occupied territories. Of course, it manifests differently with blockade in Gaza Strip and the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So can you briefly, and again, this is something we could have another entire webinar on, tell us what the challenges and restrictions imposed by Israel are and how they specifically impact these sectors and how children can access them. And as we noted earlier, what about these obligations that Israel has as the occupying power, especially towards these children?
Well, thank you for this question. Actually, this is very broad and a huge topic. It needs hours of discussions, but let me concentrate on the obligations. Two sets of laws, the general law, international law, I mean, mainly the Geneva Convention. The second is the human rights law. Both Gaza and the West Bank are occupied territory. And as an occupying power, Israel has the duty to respect Geneva Convention, has to respect the provisions of the convention. And I just remind that the Geneva Conventions in general were designed in the aftermath of World War II just to avoid the atrocities perpetrated and committed during the war against civilians. In general, they are designed to set a kind of rules for the states who are in war to avoid the atrocities of the war, mainly civilian. We are talking about mainly the Fourth Geneva Convention that is designed to protect civilians in times of war and their property. And this is a guarantee to protect the civilians. Of course, the convention puts very detailed duties on the occupying power, in this case Israel, and a very specific protection, I would say, to children in particular. And this is a long, we are talking about a series of obligations, but whether in terms of their personal safety, their right to life, in terms of their welfare, and the duty to provide, let's say, provisions, foods, and other things for their lives. It details on the detention procedures and so on, a lot of things but the main idea is to protect civilians, but more importantly, to put some more even safeguardings to protect children. The second component is the human rights law. Almost all human rights treaties and convention, I think no single convention that doesn't tackle children or be considered as part of the, people at large. So the protection entitled to a man in terms of dignity, blah, blah. All the range of, let's say, Bill of Rights, Bill of Human Rights apply also, but we are talking also about specific guarantees enshrined in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, as Miranda said. And this sets a very detailed protection for children on all levels, whether in terms of the personal safety, in terms of the growth and development, health, education. Those are the applicable two sets of law, and both again as applicable. However, Israel does not respect both, even when it comes to the Geneva Convention. They reject the very idea of applicability to the OBT. So they reject that the Geneva Conventions are applied to the OBT. The second, Israel is a party to the Convention on the Right of the Child, but in every single report, as part of their duty to submit to the Commission or the Committee on the Right of the Child, they are supposed to report on how they fulfilled their obligation towards the Convention, including in all areas under its control, including, of course, the OBT. However, Israel, from day one, they reject and they refuse to report the OBT. And this is a standing issue almost in every single concluding observations of the committee. Every single time they remind Israel that it's a duty also to report on the fulfillment of the convention and the OBT.
Thank you, Hamdi, for that comprehensive answer. And Miranda, I want to ask you if you have anything to add to that. And then also, obviously there's a Palestinian Authority, and despite an entire other conversation we can have about their representation, their legitimacy, their role in, enabling much of these crimes, what is the role of the Palestinian Authority in terms of the realities and futures of Palestinian children?
Yeah, I mean, Hamdi answered this question, I think, very comprehensively. And I think to the point where Israeli authorities reject that they must, that the Geneva Conventions apply to the OBT. I think, look at Gaza, look at the West Bank, look at the Israeli military bases and stations throughout the West Bank, the settlements, how Israeli authorities control every single thing and person that enters or leaves Gaza. I think, it seems that everybody except Israeli authorities understand that these lands are under Israeli occupation. One thing that we've done as a child rights organization regarding the Palestinian Authority is we have an elected children's council in the West Bank that seeks to educate Palestinian children, mostly in the sort of middle school, high school age, about their human rights, how to become human rights defenders in their communities, how to, if they see a situation where a child's rights are being violated, how to get in contact with DCI Palestine so that we can follow up on these cases and hold people to account. Part of that has included facilitating meetings with between children and local Palestinian authorities in order to really push Palestinian authorities to understand that they too have the obligations to uphold these rights, to protect children's rights, and yeah, in addition to obviously Israeli authorities and Israeli forces are sort of the main holder of power in this equation, but we do work to make sure that the Palestinian authorities know that is the case for them too.
Thank you. And in this next section,
Some more.
yes, Hamdi, go ahead.
Sorry. Palestine, we are talking about the BA, yes, but Palestine is also a party to the Convention on the Right of the Child. As such, there are obligations stemmed from the commitment of ratification, and they are supposed also to report to the Committee on the Right of the Child periodically on the fulfillment of this. And of course, they are, as Miranda said, yeah, they are also responsible. Of course, we acknowledge the the tremendous challenges imposed by the occupation. And for example, the BA is responsible, or the Palestinian Authority is responsible for education. But now, as we see in Gaza, the entire Gaza children lost one school, the destruction. We can come to this point, but this is a challenge in areas like the West Bank, the closure of the areas, the cantonization of the West Bank hinders the fulfillment or the applicability, the capacity and the capability of the PA to fulfill its obligation. Not to mention areas just like Area C, the education and the destruction of the schools by Israeli forces, not to mention Hebrew in particular, and the miserable situation and the checkpoints even for children on the age of 7. They pass several checkpoints just to reach their schools and so on. So yes, again, the Palestinian Authority is responsible, but we are aware about the challenges posed by Israeli occupation.
Yeah, absolutely important to remember that the PA, even if it was an effective, representative, transparent actor, is only able to function under the restrictions of Israeli occupation. Thanks for that. I want to get into the specifics of what's going on across the territories, and we don't want to contribute, of course, to the fragmentation of Palestinians by kind of separating them according to geography, but we want to understand how Israeli obligations are both breached and how violations and violence are manifest in these territories, which is different. And we'll discuss Israel's treatment of its own citizens, including children, in a different webinar. So I want to first talk about the specific harms that children are facing in Gaza. I kind of went into a little bit of the numbers, but, UNICEF reports, again, this kind of 12, 13,000 children have been killed, thousands more injured. This unbearable number of amputees. We've seen amputations in children less than 1 year of age. The lack of medical care in general. So, routine vaccinations or care for children with cancer or other ailments. Can you both talk a little bit about this kind of the death and disablement and, of course, the displacement and what it's meant now that we're 6 months into this with no apparent end in sight? Hamdi, could you please start us off?
Well, civilians in Gaza have been put in the middle, in the eye of the storm, I would say. So if we have to define the war, it's a real war on civilians. This is according to our monitoring. We are there monitoring the situation, and our mission is to protect civilians and to monitor through very independent work. The children are the most vulnerable, so they paid the heaviest price. I will just give some clue on that. I will quote from two testimonies, if you can give me a time on the impact of the children. A family, the testimony, we got the testimony, my colleague got the testimony from a mother and her child, a 14 years old child. They, after being displaced multiple times, they ended up in a school, which is a shelter. The school is never a shelter, I mean, anyway, but then that was in Gaza City, and then later on they've been besieged by Israeli forces for more than a week, and subjected even to bombardment. Many people killed in the school, but then the Israeli forces decided to enter inside the school. They entered inside the schools. the school first asked all women and children to leave the school. So the women testified to PCHR that she left with her young children. One of them, the older, 14 years old, was accompanied by his father, but so they were still at the school. Then the boy, the mother said, I mean, later she was joined by her son. He was without, I mean, like a sweater. He was with his undershirt, and she was asking, where was your undershirt, sweater? And he said, I maybe lost it, forget it at one of the classrooms in the school. Then later, the boy testified to PCHR that he was together with like his father and 3-4 other men, and they were just talking to each other. They decided to, I mean, to go to speak to the soldiers. One of them commanded Hebrew, so they were encouraged just to go to the soldiers, and they decided to have like to carry like white flags, not white flags, white clothing anyway, any white material. So they decided to go just to speak to the soldiers that they were, I mean, merely civilians, had nothing to do with any fightings, no activists, no militants in the school. Once they just, before they approach the soldiers from far away, they start shooting at them. The boy said, I saw my father trying to escape the shooting. Then he fell down and bled to death. While I was passing by, I took off my sweater and I mean, covered the body of my father. And when I left, I didn't want to tell my mom because I lost my father, and I didn't want to lose my mother too because she will return back to the school. So later on, he informed his mom about the case. This is one of the, I cannot really, this is what from November until now, it's in my mind. And can you imagine how is the situation of the child? I'm just listening. I'm just reading the testimony, but how is it like about this 14 years old child? Another story, and just a few seconds. It's a mother also testifying about her 99 years old daughter in Khan Yunis. This time the girl was all the time crying, screaming, in a very terrible psychological situation because she is sheltering at the very same school that was supposed to be her school. She was talking about her exams. The very same, it's not a different school, the very same school, the school that is supposed to be a place for education, for development, for personal development, for meeting with her classmates and so on, turned to be a shelter and unsafe shelter. So I mean, those are the stories that we are collecting. So this again, the situation of children is beyond any human imagination. What we hear, what they face, the number of people killed. I think Yara already mentioned the figures, but what to mention? What you are talking about? Orphans, about people who are left without. Sometimes we documented cases the entire family being killed, but one child or two child left. Let's say, what to do with those people? More than 1,000 child with amputation. I mean, and now they are all displaced, facing hunger, facing the daily bombardments. I witnessed the first 2 months of the war, and I know when it is bombing in the nearby or bombing sometimes the same place, and living without electricity, without water, without food. For a child, it's a luxury to speak of other components of his needs for playtime and so on. This is luxury. We cannot speak of that anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamdi. And Miranda, I'm going to ask you to add to that and also ask you to kind of play out more a situation, a topic that Hamdi breached a little bit, which is this issue of famine. We've heard these increasing alarm bells about imposing famine, looming famine. Now we're hearing in parts of North Gaza there are famine. Dozens of children known to have died from starvation. We have pregnant women who are giving birth to stillborn or underweight babies. Can you talk to us a little about that?
Yeah, definitely. I was listening to the testimonies that Hamdi shared and thinking back to October, November, and what it was like to do this work then. And one brief thing I just wanted to share with all of you before discussing malnutrition was our DCIP for the last 20 years or so has had one field researcher in Gaza. His name is Mohammed Abu Rukba. And this has been his life's work. He, documented every single child fatality in all of the past military offensives on the Gaza Strip, since he began working at DCIP in the mid-2000s. The Great March of Return, COVID-19, everything. He was able to do it. And, he and his family were displaced from Jabalia in just the first few days of this Israeli military offensive. And he and we've contracted some other short-term field workers it's just impossible. The scale of the death and destruction is simply too much to wrap our heads around. And I was remembering back to, I think it was maybe about 10 days in last October, and the child death toll was getting close to 1,000, or maybe it had just passed 1,000. And I was thinking about our work as a human rights organization is, when you're documenting a child fatality, you're really trying to piece together those very, very last moments of a child's life to determine what happened, who was at fault, what laws were broken. Mohammed and our other field researchers they're going to speak to the family and eyewitnesses on the worst day of their lives, worst moment of their lives. But I would find some comfort in knowing that, we have collected this story. This is not this child's story, and their memory won't disappear. We've created a record of what happened, to do everything that we can to, make sure this doesn't happen again. And I remember when the child death toll had just passed 1,000, and Mohammed and his family they were already displaced. And I remember thinking that we're not going to know all their names. And that was something we'd always been able to do. And so I've been sitting with that recently, thinking about as the child death toll, passes 14,000 and what that means. Turning to malnutrition and the crisis of, hunger and dehydration that we're especially seeing in northern Gaza, due to Israeli authorities deliberately blocking and severely restricting humanitarian aid, both its entrance into the Gaza Strip and its distribution, by repeatedly targeting aid workers and aid caravans, restricting access to different areas in Gaza, especially the north. Malnutrition is not a death by natural causes. This is a man-made crisis. Starvation is a deliberate political choice that Israeli authorities have made. Children in Gaza are not starving because because the world does not grow enough food for them to eat. They are starving because Israeli authorities have decided that it is okay for them to starve. And in fact, it furthers their campaign of genocide against Palestinians. Malnutrition is extremely preventable. It is a treatable condition if children are able to, get care from doctors that have the proper resources. And, I think the latest number from the Ministry of Health is they shared that 28 children had died of malnutrition and starvation. I believe almost all of these were from the same hospital in northern Gaza. And I think we should really understand this number to be a vast underestimation of how many children are actually dying of malnutrition and starvation in Gaza. The Ministry of Health can really only report deaths from children who are hospitalized, or if their parents or other family members report these numbers to the ministry. So these, as many children are starving in displacement camps or unable to reach a hospital, or the hospital that's closest to them has been attacked or laid under siege by Israeli forces. It's important to understand that that number is more than likely just a very small piece of the whole picture. And you mentioned a little bit of this earlier, Yara, but most of the children who have died of malnutrition have been newborn babies, which indicates that their pregnant mothers were malnourished severely for months at the end of their pregnancy. That is not something that happens in a week. This is, long-term malnutrition, dehydration, that causes babies to be born starving. And the sort of other group of children that have been documented to have died from starvation are children with disabilities. So children with, I think there have been several with cerebral palsy or other conditions that require children to have a special diet and receive continued medical care that has not been available or an option for them as Israeli authorities continue deliberately blocking aid into Gaza.
Yeah, and of course now it's to the point where even a massive influx of aid, which again we're not likely to see, would not stave off most of these consequences. And for malnutrition children, some of them will have stunted growth forever. Hamdi, my mom grew up in the West Bank, and one thing she would always tell me is that no matter how bad things got, through 67 and everything that followed, they always knew that the worst circumstances were those faced by the orphans, because for as long as there's been this presence, this Israeli presence, there have been Palestinian children that have been orphaned by either their parents being killed or detained, gone missing, these kinds of circumstances. I remember in the 2014 war in Gaza, we heard the statistic of 1,500 orphans, and that just seemed already unbearably high. And now we are seeing orphans perhaps in the tens of thousands with no end in sight, and otherwise unaccompanied children. Perhaps they got separated from their families or something. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what happens to most of these children, now and in the future?
Well, thank you. I mean, nobody can tell the exact number or give a figure about the number of orphans as a result of the war. Some of the figures I have suggest that at least 6,000 mothers were killed with 19,000 children. So this is even very, very, I do not trust if this is the case. The number is much higher. What's about those who lost two parents? What's about the father? So I estimate the figure of the number of orphans as a result of the war is in thousand. Maybe more than 30,000 of the children or more. I cannot really give a real estimate, but it's a huge number, unprecedented. And it's they are left. Mostly they are left with other family members. In Gaza, one of the blessings for the extended family is to have this service. So they would stay with an aunt, with an uncle, with other families, and this would be a burden to the already very poor family. So if they joined an uncle, the uncle has his own family as well with the children. So we add more children to the family. And I am afraid there is no single institution now capable of even handling these huge numbers. Prior to the war, there was, for example, in Rafah, an organization that was hosting a children village called Children Village. It used to host dozens of orphans, not what we're not talking about thousands. And even a few months ago, they managed, after the threat to invade Rafah, they managed, in cooperation with some international organizations and some I think, foreign countries, they managed to evacuate the children to Bethlehem to join another program in Bethlehem. So this is the case. They are safe. Those children are safe. But the entire population in Gaza, all of the orphans in Gaza are unsafe at all. And they are not suffering only as civilians, but they are suffering as children and as orphans as well. It's I cannot really describe how they manage to find their livings, where they stay, it's how they struggle to protect themselves. Those who lost the parents, and in our very specific issue, when we are talking about the father, for example, and the mother, of course, those are the first layer of protection for a child. So if you, from day one, you lose this family protection, you are in entire chaos. And I'm not a psychologist, but I imagine when this is you are left without protection from the family side. Add to this, you are not in, and this is a normal situation without a war. You are in the middle of the war. You are in the middle of attack. I what generation is coming for Gaza? What I wonder how a child who lost his father, mother, maybe other members of the family, sometimes he's the only survivor of this attack. His psychology, what do you expect from him 10 years or from now?
Mhm.
What do you expect to see?
Yeah, and thank you. Miranda, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just to say that, you know, as Hamdi said, the scale of the orphans is really, you know, unknown. I think there are many children who do end up in the care of an extended family member. We've also seen children where the older siblings are left caring for the younger siblings. And I think this group of children, I think, really speaks to the need for a child-centered approach to any policy decisions or any policy interventions moving forward, because this is a very, very vulnerable group of children.
Thank you. And I want to move in our remaining time to talk a little bit about another group of vulnerable children, which is the children in the West Bank. Now, we know that since October 7th, there's been 116 Palestinian children killed, 35 just since 2024, including 2 US citizens. And this is according to documentation collected by DCI Palestine. We've had these constant raids, especially in the refugee camps in the West Bank. We have these road closures and restrictions. Miranda, can you start off by telling us a little bit about these extrajudicial murders of Palestinian children, and then we'll touch on detention in a few minutes.
Thanks, Yara. So DCI Palestine has been documenting child fatalities for a long time, more than 2 decades. And I think it really goes without saying that what we've seen in the last year and a half, but especially in the last 6 months, is really at a scale that nobody has seen before. Most of the children who have been killed in the occupied West Bank by Israeli forces or settlers have been shot with live ammunition. The majority of them were shot in the head or the chest, and these are areas that are nearly always fatal. Areas like your chest or your torso, you will bleed out very, very quickly if you aren't killed instantly. In about a third of the cases that we documented last year, Israeli forces deliberately blocked paramedics or ambulances from accessing wounded children until they were dead. They waited. Israeli forces would shoot a child, surround them on the ground or wherever they were shot, and wait until they were dead, until they let ambulances and paramedics through to collect the body. Many of these children were shot from hundreds of meters away, which sometimes is close to 1,000 feet away, which indicates that these are only shots that could be carried out by a very, very highly skilled military sniper, shooting with, precision weapons likely funded and bought by the United States. To touch very, very briefly on Israeli settler violence, there were, I believe, 2 cases in the last year and one in this year so far who was actually an American child, a Palestinian American child who was struck and killed with live ammunition. And we were unable to determine if the fatal bullet that killed him was from an Israeli soldier or an Israeli settler, because both groups were firing on Palestinian civilians at the same time. The child was struck by 1 bullet. It was one of them. But we were not able to determine which. And I think that is, that speaks to how settlers enable Israeli forces and Israeli forces enable settlers. Many settlers receive weapons from the Israeli government. They served in the IDF, so they have military training. And we're really seeing from settlers and Israeli forces, they're shooting Palestinian children to kill. They're not shooting to wound. They're shooting to kill them. Whether or not they may have committed any offense that warrants lethal force, which is almost never. And then in last summer, we saw Israeli forces introduce aerial attacks in the West Bank for the first time since the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, which have mostly been concentrated in Palestinian refugee camps in the northern West Bank. So just before this call, I was working on a new report that we got in from a Palestinian child in the occupied West Bank who was shot and killed by Israeli forces this morning. So it's really, it's nonstop in the West Bank too.
Yeah.
I just
Yes, Hamdi, please.
because having said that, the deliberate shooting, the targeting of the children and the civilians at large goes with no accountability whatsoever on the level of the Israeli system. Tell me how many cases brought to the Israeli courts and we see results. We filed thousands of cases of complaints to the Israeli system. And this is the case, the so-called advocate military general. He is the body, and his office is the body that is supposed to investigate those serious violations or those crimes. In no single case he investigated, in no single case, but in one case, I recall in one case, and I will tell you how it happened. A few years ago, during the Great March of Repair, and we all know it's been civilian marches, dancing and chanting, protesting, civilian protests adjacent to the borderline between Gaza and Israel. And Israeli forces killed 14 years old child in the daylight. He was climbing the fence line, and it was clear to everybody, to the soldiers, to the snipers, he was a child, unweaponed, civilian, carrying nothing, posed no threat whatsoever, even though killed him. Israel decided to investigate. Why? Because the whole case was videotaped and went viral on social media. That's why they decided to open an investigation. Now, the outcome of the investigation, the soldier was convicted, but not convicted of murder, because it was clearly murder in the daylight. Rather, he was convicted of violating the rules of engagement, the firing regulations. What's the sentence then? He was sentenced for 1 month to be served as labor in a military base. So this is the severest, the harshest penalty on an Israeli soldier. So my point is that all those crimes committed against civilians at large, committed against children in particular, go and continue to go unpunished by the Israeli system, which is a cover-up to all crimes committed the army. We don't trust the judiciary in Israel. Israel introduced itself to the entire world that it's the oasis of democracy, and they have mechanisms for accountability, they have separation of power, they have independent judiciary. But when it comes to Palestinians, the entire judiciary, whether a military judiciary, which is the applicable, mostly the OBT, or the regular, no trust that any Israeli independent judiciary when it comes to Palestinian, but rather it's part of the crime, it's part of the cover-up. And even when we appeal to the so-called advocate military general, he is supposedly incapable of investigating these attacks or crimes against civilians. Why? Because he has two hats. He part of the army. He is part of the army, so he is under the command of the chief of the staff of the Israeli army. Second, he is in this capacity, he is an advisor. He is advising. So he is consulted in all operation against Palestinians. The second, the investigatory hat, more likely to investigate a friendly fire, some misconduct by the army, but not against Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, such an important point that for everything we're talking about today, there has been almost no accountability, and the very few instances that do receive any investigation, either it's through an independent Western media source, which sometimes investigates these things, or Israel investigates itself and finds that it's done nothing wrong. Or, like you said, incidents now are going viral on social media that show clearly the Israeli narrative is false and is just used as a justification to kill Palestinians there. In our remaining time, I want to make sure we talk about military detention of Palestinians, both in the West Bank and Gaza. We've seen these absolutely disturbing images of stripped prisoners, primarily men, but sometimes boys in the Gaza Strip that have been detained. Some were released later, indicating that they had been held without food, tortured. And for decades, Palestinians in the West Bank, including children, have been detained, sometimes with military raids in the middle of the night to their homes, sometimes simply for being accused of throwing stones at military soldiers. They are often held in administrative detention, which for our audience means that there is no trial, no charges, and they can be held essentially indefinitely in this state. There are hundreds of Palestinian children held in administrative detention, often unable to even communicate with their parents, which is a flagrant violation of law. So Miranda, could you please start us off quickly with telling us a little bit about military detention of children, especially post-October 7th, and then Hamdi, we will end with you.
Thanks, Yara. So part of what DCI Palestine does is provide legal aid to children who have been detained and prosecuted by the Israeli military. And alongside that, we collect affidavits from children to document the types of ill treatment and torture they were exposed to at the hands of Israeli forces during the arrest, during the interrogation, we collect testimonies from children after they're released from prison to create a record of their experience and, you know, a record of the rights that were violated. Typically in sort of a, I hate to say a normal year, but in a typical year, Israeli forces would detain somewhere between 500 and 700 Palestinian children in the occupied West Bank. And since October 7th, they've detained an estimated somewhere probably between 450 and 500 Palestinian children. That's not to say that is the current number of children who are currently in detention, but who have been detained at some point for some amount of time since October. Israeli forces have basically cut off all communication with children. They're not allowed to have their parents visit them. It's very difficult for lawyers to visit them. And what we've heard from children who have been released is that the conditions in prison are worse than ever before. You know, many children crammed into rooms that are designed to house just a few children, regular beatings, attacks by military dogs, children burned by soldiers' cigarettes. And then, you know, turning to Gaza, and I'll mostly let Hamdi speak to this, but you know, Israeli forces have detained many Palestinians from Gaza, and they are not being held in the Israeli military detention system. They're being held under the Unlawful Combatants Act, mostly in you know, Israeli military bases or prisons in southern Israel. And Israeli forces have released basically no information on at large how many people there are. But including children, there's been no information on how many children, their names, their ages, where they're being kept, if they're being charged with anything. And so I think just to close that thought, I think, you know, we've documented the torture of children in the occupied West Bank in the Israeli military detention system for a very long time. And that's the information that we know to be true. That's the information that we have access to. And so, you know, I really fear how children are being treated in the dark when there is no access to lawyers, human rights organizations, the UN, or their families. So I think that's a important focus moving forward.
Yeah, very disturbing. And Hamdi, please.
As we are rushing or running out of time, but just very brief to Miranda's point on Gaza. Thousands of people were arrested, were detained by Israeli forces in Gaza. Nobody can tell the exact number, as they are detained in military bases or centers, detention camps, controlled by the army and by the intelligence, and directly under the cabinet of war. It has nothing to do with the prison service or any judicial body whatsoever. They are denied access to their lawyers. They are denied access even to the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. They are denied access or any visit by human rights organizations, by our lawyers, so nobody can tell. The only way we know about these detentions and how they live is those who are released mostly after 45 days or more. Some of them are released. The only way they release them in Rafah, to go to Rafah, where our teams are. And our team are working tirelessly just to meet hundreds of those former detainees and to take these testimonies. As such, in person, I've been able to review dozens of these testimonies. I can just tell that the level of, I've been working with BCHR since 1995. In my entire life, I haven't been exposed to this dosage of torture or stories about torture committed against those detainees. The only place that is similar to this situation is Guantanamo. I have nothing in mind other than Guantanamo. Many of the people who were arrested were children between the age 16 and 18. And this is what I started. They considered this category of children as adults.
Thank you, Hamdi, Miranda. Obviously, we're at time here, and there's of course so much more to discuss. The mental trauma that these children will be facing for the rest of their lives. All of these children have of course been out of school this entire time, and many of their schools, including every university, has been destroyed. Many that have been able to evacuate now face uncertain futures in Egypt and elsewhere. Their employment futures, and even just how do they fit in with the future movement of Palestinian liberation, and what does that even look like for them? Will they see that in their lifetime? These are all important questions that hopefully we can have an opportunity to discuss in the future. So I want to first thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you, really. Thank you, Yara. Been honored really to be with you, with the wonderful audience who are listening and hearing this debate on our discussion on Gaza children. All what I want to say is that together we can make a change. Your voice is extremely important in support of a ceasefire, because a ceasefire in Gaza is the only pathway to stop this carnage against civilians, against children, to stop this genocide. So together, I think we can make a change. Every person has a duty. Every person, we cannot underestimate. Do not have to underestimate the very little effort that can be done by each single person. Any contribution, any activity, even is just sharing a post, sharing on social media is vitally important at this moment to stop this carnage against civilians in Gaza. Thank you again.
Thank you, and thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Yara, and thank you, Hamdi.
And I want to encourage, people looking for organizations to support, of course, Defense for Children International-Palestine and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights are doing incredible work and have been, and it's this documentation and this advocacy is so invaluable. I want to thank everyone who joined us live or is watching or listening to this after the fact. And please check back at the FMEP website, which is www.fmep.org, for video and audio of this webinar. And for a list of many resources, thank you, Sarah Ann, for putting those in the chat related to this conversation and for future programming. So thank you all so much.